Hey guys, tonight we're taking a time machine back to a place even more awkward than your high school prom, the Dark Ages. That's right. Picture this. No running water, no Wi-Fi, and the only way to stay clean is by literally covering yourself in mud. And let's not forget about the medieval love life, which, spoiler alert, wasn't exactly romantic. Tonight, we're diving into what life was actually like in the Middle Ages, from bathing, or the lack thereof, to the art of courtship. Trust me, you'll never look at modern plumbing the same way again. But before we get into the weeds of history, take a second to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Only if you actually enjoy what I do here, though. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. Somehow, it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, right? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft white noise, and get comfy, because we're about to drop you straight into the year 1066. Ever wonder what medieval people did when they wanted to freshen up? How did they get cozy without Netflix? What was sex really like without modern contraception? And how in the world did people survive this century, let alone thrive in it? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1347. You have no toothpaste, no deodorant, and you're already regretting that second helping of meat pie. Good luck. Imagine waking up in a world where the only alarm clock is a rooster, and the first task of the day is trying not to roll over into a pile of your own urine. Yes, medieval mornings weren't exactly luxurious. You don't get a snooze button, and the idea of fresh sheets is laughable. Instead, you get to battle the sounds of a few hundred other peasants in the barn, trying to breathe through the smell of unwashed bodies and farm animals. You'll wish you could roll back over, but nope. It's time to face the medieval world. The first thing you notice, before even opening your eyes, is the cold. It's like the room has been dunked in ice water overnight. The medieval bed, if you can call it that, is probably a pile of straw, tossed together in a barely contained heap, smelling faintly like the hay it's made from. You're not surrounded by soft pillows and blankets. Oh no. You're in a crowded room where personal space is a distant dream, and your blanket, if you even have one, is just as likely to be someone else's foot as it is to be warm. You'd think your body might adjust to the cold over time, but no, it doesn't. The chill seeps into your bones, and the only thing you can do is pull your threadbare cloak tighter and brace yourself for the morning. There's no heated mattress pad, no fluffy duvet to nestle into. It's a world where you wake up with your neck sore from awkwardly sleeping on a pile of damp hay, and your body aching from the night spent curled up in an attempt to avoid the other bodies around you. It's more snooze than sleep, and your neck's probably never going to be the same again. And as you finally open your eyes, the daylight isn't exactly comforting. You're not in a cozy room with soft morning light filtering in through your curtains. No, it's either the light of a tiny window, or worse yet, a crack in the roof that lets in the dim grey of dawn. Or worse, a sudden splash of mud from the outside. You're surrounded by your fellow peasants, some snoring, others just lying there wide awake, hoping for a few more minutes of peace before they have to get up and start the day. But you can't afford to wait. The rooster outside, loud and relentless, has already done its job. Time to get moving. And then the smell hits you. It's an odor so pungent, it's almost tangible. Forget fancy lavender-scented candles, or those essential oils you love to dab on before you go to sleep. In the medieval world, the scent that greets you in the morning is a mix of sweat, urine, wet straw, and the lingering musk of livestock. Oh, and don't forget the faint, omnipresent smell of manure from the barn next door, where the cows and pigs live just as close as your neighbors do. Personal hygiene is something you think about only once in a while, mainly when you're trying to avoid the headache-inducing stench. The task now is to get out of bed, or what passes for a bed. That's not as easy as it sounds. First, you have to maneuver through the thick mess of bodies, carefully stepping over the ones who decided to sleep a little longer. And don't step on the rat either. Yes, rats. They're there too, scurrying about, most likely hunting for leftover scraps from last night's meal. If you're lucky, you'll avoid them. But if you're not, well, you'll get a friendly morning nibble. The idea of a warm, cozy bed is foreign to you. Here, beds are functional, survival tools, not places of comfort. Once you're upright, you'll probably notice your legs are stiff, your back's sore, and you've got a headache. No fancy memory foam mattress, no relaxing morning routine. It's a fight just to get yourself moving. Now, it's time for what passes as getting ready. Your wardrobe consists of 1, maybe 2 layers of clothing, if you're lucky. A tunic, maybe some woolen leggings if it's winter. Forget fashion. There's no time for that. You're just trying to get dressed without freezing to death. Of course, there's also the matter of personal hygiene, or the lack of it. The idea of a shower is laughable. Your options for cleaning up are limited to maybe a quick splash of cold water from a nearby bucket, or a quick rub down with a cloth that's probably been used for something far more unsavory. Let's face it, your grooming routine today will consist of hoping that no one notices how badly you smell. Now, you've somehow managed to stand, possibly smelling worse than you did when you woke up, and you're finally ready to face the medieval day. You look around and see everyone else trudging toward the common area. They've probably got the same sleep-deprived, exhausted look on their faces, just like you. There's no coffee here, no caffeine to smooth over the rough edges of life. Just a few hours of manual labor, followed by more manual labor, all while dealing with the smell of animals and the cold that won't let up. And that's just the morning. Trust me, you're not going to be missing the medieval lifestyle anytime soon. So, next time you wake up to the gentle hum of your alarm, the warmth of your blankets, and the promise of a cup of coffee, just know you're living in luxury compared to your medieval ancestors. It's time for breakfast, but don't get too excited. Your meal is probably going to be some stale bread and a tiny sliver of cheese. If you're lucky, there might be some watery porridge. Oh, joy! Forget eggs, bacon, or avocado toast. This isn't the 21st century, it's the 11th century, where food is scarce. And you're lucky if your morning is anything but a long, miserable stretch of chewing on the hardest thing you've ever bitten into. So, is this the medieval version of clean eating? Yeah, probably, but with fewer health benefits. Let's break this down. Imagine your breakfast is a single hard loaf of bread, about as chewy as a brick, but only half as satisfying. You might think this is some sort of rustic, wholesome meal, but that artisan loaf is more like a weapon than a snack. You could try to nibble on it, but it'll just end up feeling like you're gnawing on a rock. There's no sourdough starter here, no fluffy, air-filled pockets of joy. It's basically the equivalent of eating a slice of cardboard. And if that's not enough, it's not even fresh. That bread has probably been hanging around for days, if not weeks. In the medieval world, The concept of stale doesn't even exist because everything is always stale. They didn't have the luxury of preservatives or a quick trip to the bakery. So, you'll chew it down, trying to imagine you're at some fancy medieval bistro. Spoiler, you're not. Now, to wash it down, you're hoping for something to drink. Maybe, if you're really, really lucky, you get a cup of beer. Yes, beer. That's right. Breakfast of champions, right? In the Middle Ages, even peasants drank beer, but it wasn't the cold, crisp lager you enjoy today. No. This stuff was more like fermented soup with a touch of barley and yeast that would have you second-guessing your decision to drink it. But it's technically liquid, so hey, it counts, right? The good news is, at least it's not as heavy on the stomach as the bread. The bad news is that it's probably just as strong, if not stronger. But let's not get carried away. Beer for breakfast wasn't exactly a luxury. It was just a fact of survival. Most peasants couldn't afford water, and in the age before clean water was widely available, beer was safer than trying to drink from a local well. So, cheers to staying hydrated. Sort of. If you're in the mood for something a little less alcoholic, you might find a spoonful of porridge in your bowl. But let's be real. This is no gourmet oatmeal with almond milk and chia seeds. This is the 11th century equivalent of slop. It's essentially just water, oats, and maybe a pinch of salt, if you're lucky. Think of it as a sad, tasteless soup that you're supposed to eat for breakfast. But it's hot, so there's that. The good news is that, unlike the bread, it's relatively soft and won't break your teeth. The bad news? You'll be hungry again in an hour, and you might still be thinking about that bite of bread you couldn't get down. But hey, it's technically food, so no complaints, right? Now, if you're one of the fortunate few, you might get a bit of cheese to go with your bread. But don't get too excited. This isn't the creamy, aged cheddar you might be imagining. It's probably a crumbly, hard piece of something that could double as a makeshift doorstop. Cheese in the Middle Ages wasn't about gourmet pairings with crackers. It was about survival. So you'll gnaw on that for a bit, imagining it's the finest brie, and pray that it holds you over until lunch, which, spoiler alert, is probably going to be more stale bread. And let's not forget the possibility of meat. Well, if you can afford it. For the peasant class, meat was more of a rare luxury, a special treat that might happen once a week if the family was lucky. So don't even dream of bacon sizzling in the pan or eggs frying up in a skillet. Your protein is likely to be more along the lines of a tiny bit of salted fish or a tough, stringy piece of meat that's as close to edible as a leather boot. You might be able to cook it in the stew pot if it hasn't already been sitting there for a couple of days, becoming more of a broth than anything else. There's no coffee here, no fancy fruit bowls, and no avocado toast. Instead, you're stuck with whatever scraps are left from last night's meal or whatever you can scrounge up from the food stores. The medieval breakfast was less about nutrition and more about sheer survival. It wasn't about getting a boost of energy for the day ahead. It was about filling the pit in your stomach so you could survive another round of back-breaking work in the fields. So, next time you sit down for your perfectly balanced breakfast with a smoothie on the side, take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. Because, let's be honest, while medieval breakfasts were barely worth calling a meal, at least you can enjoy your avocado toast without worrying about whether it'll break your teeth. Forget everything you know about personal hygiene. We're talking about a world where soap is a luxury, water is used more for putting out fires than washing bodies, and the smell of people's armpits is more of a community problem than an individual one. Medieval hygiene was basically make do with what you've got, which often meant wiping yourself down with whatever was nearby, usually the same cloth that cleaned your kitchen counters. Let's dive into the absurdity of trying to stay clean in a time when bathing meant dunking yourself in cold water once every couple of months, if you're lucky. First, let's talk about the concept of bath time in the medieval world. You probably think of baths as something to do with scented oils, candles, and soft towels. In the Middle Ages? Not so much. Bathing was rare, inconvenient, and often downright uncomfortable. The few people who could afford to bathe would usually do so in a public bathhouse, which, let's be honest, was basically a glorified cesspool of humanity. Imagine cramming hundreds of people into a tiny, steamy room, all of them sweating and soaking in the same lukewarm water. You'd be lucky if the water wasn't already contaminated with, well, everything. It wasn't exactly the relaxing spa day we picture today. In fact, there was a good chance you'd leave the bathhouse smelling worse than when you went in. And don't get me started on the whole concept of soap, that little bar you rely on to get your skin feeling fresh. Not so much in the medieval world. Soap was a rare commodity, usually made from animal fat and ashes, and was far more likely to leave you feeling greasy than clean. So, you'd have to make do with a good old rub-down with whatever you had available. Maybe a damp cloth, maybe just some rough water, and occasionally a splash of vinegar to help you feel clean. If you were especially lucky, you'd be able to freshen up with a bit of perfume, made from herbs or flowers that masked the smell of sweat, dirt, and livestock. Now, let's talk about the real problem, the medieval version of a shower. Spoiler alert, it didn't exist. If you wanted to get clean, you had two options. Either you jumped into a river, hoping the current didn't carry you away, or you found a nearby lake and prayed it wasn't too full of animals and muck. Rivers were popular because they were free, but there's always that tiny problem of getting wet and freezing to death in the cold, fast-moving waters. So, while rivers were technically a place to bathe, they were also a good way to catch hypothermia. As a result, many people simply avoided the water altogether, opting for a quick splash from a bucket or nothing at all. In the world of medieval hygiene, brushing your teeth wasn't a thing either. Forget about toothpaste or electric toothbrushes. Medieval people didn't even know what plaque was, but they sure knew what decay was. To clean their teeth, they used twigs, charcoal, or even cloth, hoping that something, anything, would keep their breath from sending people running. But let's be real here. Nobody had a clue how to take care of their teeth, which means people's smiles were probably a little more rustic than we'd like to think. Then, of course, there's the issue of clothing. You're probably imagining medieval people sporting pristine, clean outfits, but in reality, they wore the same clothes day after day without the luxury of washing them. And when you did wash your clothes, it wasn't in a washer with fabric softener. No, you'd scrub your clothes in cold, dirty water, and even then, they would still be covered in the stains and smells from whatever grime you had accumulated over the past few weeks. There was no such thing as fresh clothes, just clothes that were a little less disgusting than yesterday. But wait, there's more. Let's not forget about your hair. If you were lucky enough to have hair, chances are it was long and tangled, as combs were rare and washing hair was, well, optional. So, while you're walking around, you'll be greeted by the ever-present smell of unwashed hair, mixed with the stench of animal dung and sweat. The fun part. This wasn't just a personal hygiene issue, it was a community issue. Everyone around you smelled the same, so you all just kind of accepted it. It was like a "you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours" situation, except instead of scratching, you were just living with the stench. In fact, body odor was so widespread that it became part of the medieval charm. People didn't even notice how bad it was because everyone smelled terrible. Personal space didn't exist, so people were up close and personal with each other, smelling everything, especially at markets where bodies were packed in like sardines. The air was thick with the scent of animals, food, and, of course, the general musk of unwashed humans. If you were lucky, maybe you got a whiff of a freshly baked loaf of bread. If not, well, there was always the sweet scent of unfiltered sweat. In the end, surviving the medieval hygiene routine wasn't about staying fresh, it was about survival. The idea of clean skin, shiny hair, or a refreshing bath was a distant dream for most people. Instead, you got creative with whatever was available, hoped for the best, and probably found yourself thinking, well, at least I'm not dead yet. So next time you're in the shower, enjoying the luxury of hot water and soap, take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come, and how much nicer it is to smell like a person instead of a farmyard. The art of courtship. How to woo someone. When you smell like a farmyard. In the Dark Ages, when it came to romance, forget flowers and chocolates. In fact, don't even think about romantic candlelit dinners. If you were trying to court someone back then, you were probably just trying to keep yourself from collapsing from the stench, while hoping that maybe, just maybe, the other person didn't mind that you hadn't bathed in weeks. It was all about the art of pretending that maybe your smell is just a strong personality. Let's take a closer look at the dating scene when the concept of deodorant was still 1,000 years away. First off, let's be clear about something. Personal hygiene was not exactly a priority during the Dark Ages. So, when it came to wooing someone, you had to put all your charm, wit, and maybe a bit of awkward dancing to the test, because nothing was going to mask that body odor. If you were lucky, your date was just as smelly as you were, so the two of you could bond over mutual discomfort, trying not to gag while pretending that your overwhelming scent was some sort of mysterious allure. The goal wasn't to impress with cologne or fresh clothes. It was about surviving the encounter without fainting from the stench. Now, let's talk about the date. The word itself conjures up images of romantic dinners, walks in the park, or maybe a trip to the movies. In the Dark Ages, a date probably looked more like you and your potential suitor meeting at the local market, surrounded by the sounds of clanging carts, the smells of animals, and a few hundred other sweaty, underwashed people. If you wanted to impress someone, you didn't exactly have a fancy restaurant to whisk them away to. Instead, you might try to win them over with your charm, maybe offering a small token like a piece of cloth or some leftover bread. At least that's something, right? Courtship in the Middle Ages wasn't about grand gestures. It was more about surviving the initial meeting without being driven away by the smell. Your best bet was to somehow convince the other person that, despite all evidence to the contrary, you were a worthy partner. You might try to show off your skills. Perhaps you were handy with tools, Or maybe you could carve wood like a pro. After all, a useful partner was far more appealing than a clean one. You weren't trying to woo someone with your fresh scent, but with the promise that you could help them carry water or chop wood. Let's be real. That's the real medieval version of romance. But let's not forget the complications that came with medieval courtship. The social structure was rigid, so a knight wouldn't even look twice at a peasant, and vice versa. Marriage was often arranged by families based on land, wealth, or the need to form alliances. So, while you might be out there trying to make a good impression, there's a good chance that your love life was already being decided by someone who didn't care about your smell, but did care about whether you could inherit a decent chunk of land. Still, a little flirting never hurt anyone, right? In medieval times, flirting wasn't exactly an art form either. Forget subtle compliments or the art of the smooth pickup line. Instead, courtship might involve a bit of hand-holding, if you were lucky, or maybe a secretive meeting in the woods behind the village, where the two of you could try not to inhale too deeply. In fact, it wasn't even uncommon to sneak in a kiss, though it was usually more about trying to press your lips to someone else's, despite the discomfort of the situation. No breath mints, no gum, just the raw, unfiltered reality of medieval life. There was also the matter of what you'd wear. You probably didn't have the luxury of a freshly pressed tunic. Instead, you'd be stuck in whatever garment was closest to you, usually stained with whatever you'd been working on all day. The idea of having a dress-up occasion was far-fetched, unless, of course, you were a noble. And even then, your fine clothes probably came with a hefty dose of sweat. The wealthy were at least able to afford a few changes of clothing, but the average peasant would only have one set, which meant that getting ready for a date likely involved just trying to make yourself as presentable as possible within the confines of dirt and grime. As if things weren't complicated enough, the concept of consent was a bit, well, different in medieval times. While love and courtship was still real, many times marriage was about family agreements and securing resources. Love might grow over time, but the idea of waiting until marriage to kiss or touch someone wasn't really on the agenda. People were often expected to make do with the situation they found themselves in, even if that meant marrying someone they didn't particularly like, or even smell nice. But let's end this with a nod to how, despite everything, people did find love. Medieval courtship, while not romantic in the way we think of it today, was still filled with moments of warmth, humor, and connection. Sure, the hygiene was questionable, the clothing less than flattering, and the environment less than ideal. But the human desire for connection and companionship was the same then as it is now. Despite the mud, the sweat, and the stink, people somehow managed to find their happily ever afters, even if they didn't smell like roses. So the next time you find yourself struggling to impress someone with your fresh scent after a long day, just remember, at least you don't have to win someone over in a cloud of barnyard odors. That's one luxury modern dating has definitely improved. The birds and the bees. Or more accurately, the rats and the fleas. When it came to medieval sex, it wasn't exactly like the rom-coms you're used to. Romance wasn't something you could just pick up from a Hallmark card. It was messy, awkward, and usually involved a lot of fur-covered blankets and the possibility of contracting an unpleasant disease. So, what was medieval sex actually like? Were there any medieval love tips that would help modern couples? Spoiler alert. Romantic is not how I would describe it. First, let's talk about the setting. If you were a medieval couple looking for a little privacy, well, good luck. Most people lived in cramped, overcrowded homes, usually a single room shared with everyone in the family, the animals, and possibly a few neighbors who had come for a visit. The idea of having your own bedroom, not unless you were wealthy. For peasants, privacy was a luxury that didn't exist, so you were probably getting intimate under the same roof as your children, your parents, and a few chickens. If you managed to secure some space away from the livestock, congratulations. But you'd still be dealing with the fact that your bed, such as it was probably a lumpy pile of straw, and the blanket you were covering yourself with might be nothing more than a rough woolen cloth. Now, let's talk about what medieval people were working with in terms of hygiene, or rather, the complete lack thereof. Most medieval couples didn't exactly have the luxury of fresh sheets or a fresh body before jumping into bed. Since bathing was considered a rare luxury, and a dangerous one at that, sex was often a game of who smells the least terrible. The lack of cleanliness meant that intimacy was, well, less about romance and more about surviving the moment. Forget about candles and soft music. More likely, you were trying to make do in a room with no ventilation, surrounded by the smell of unwashed bodies, livestock, and probably some old food scraps. Let's just say that a lot of medieval sex probably came with a side of, let's just get it over with. But let's not forget the real danger of medieval sex: disease. In a time when sanitation and hygiene were practically non-existent, venereal diseases were rampant. The lack of effective contraception meant that people were constantly exposed to diseases that could ruin their lives, often literally. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted infections were common, and treatments were rudimentary at best. While some people tried to use herbs and potions to prevent pregnancy or treat diseases, these remedies weren't exactly backed by science. In fact, most of them were more about superstition than anything useful. So, while you might be trying to enjoy a passionate night with your partner, you could very well end up with a case of something far worse than an awkward encounter. Now, what about love? Well, let's just say that medieval sex wasn't all about romance and gentle caresses. In many cases, marriage wasn't based on love, but on securing resources, alliances, or producing heirs. The medieval concept of love was more about survival than anything else. Sure, there were some couples who grew fond of each other over time, but for most, marriage was a business arrangement. And the idea of romantic love was much more abstract than we think of it today. For many people, love didn't even enter the equation when it came to having children. Instead, sex was primarily about procreation, especially for the wealthy or nobility, where the primary goal was to produce an heir to inherit the family wealth and land. For the common folk, though, sex was still about reproduction, but it was also about social and emotional connection, especially in the case of long-term partnerships. After all, if you were stuck living together in a small, grimy hut with little to no personal space, a certain level of affection might have been necessary to maintain some sense of humanity. But don't expect medieval couples to be writing sweet sonnets for one another. Instead, the most romantic gesture might have been sharing the last piece of bread, or comforting each other after a long day of back-breaking labor. In the grand scheme of things, love wasn't quite as idealized as it is in modern times, but that doesn't mean it was non-existent. So, were there any medieval love tips that modern couples could use? Honestly, not much that you'd want to try. In fact, you might want to avoid the whole medieval courtship method altogether. While it was more straightforward, and by straightforward, I mean you get married, have kids, and that's pretty much the extent of your romantic life, it wasn't exactly a setup for long-lasting romance. In fact, most of medieval courtship was about survival rather than passion. If you managed to find a partner who didn't smell too bad, didn't give you a sexually transmitted disease, and could bear the thought of spending the rest of their life with you, you probably considered yourself pretty lucky. In conclusion, medieval sex wasn't exactly the fairy tale romance you might imagine. It was messy, awkward, and rife with danger. Between the lack of hygiene, the constant threat of disease, and the absence of modern romance, it's safe to say that love in the Dark Ages was far from glamorous. So, the next time you're enjoying a cozy night in with your partner, surrounded by clean sheets and a Netflix queue, just remember, at least you're not trying to get cozy in a dank, cold room with no privacy, no clean clothes, and the very real possibility of contracting a deadly disease. It's good to be alive in the modern world. Medieval fashion wasn't about looking good for Instagram. It was about survival. Clothes were designed to keep you warm, keep pests off you, and, well, to cover you. And let's be honest, they weren't always great at that. The fashion of the era was heavy, uncomfortable, and often smelled as bad as you did. But you had to wear it because it was the only option, unless you wanted to freeze, or worse, get covered in lice. Think of it as the medieval version of athleisure, if athleisure involved more wool and less flexibility. Let's start with the basics. What did medieval peasants actually wear? Well, it wasn't glamorous, that's for sure. You were probably rocking a simple wool tunic, plain, scratchy, and not exactly made for comfort. This tunic was the medieval equivalent of one size fits all, because honestly, nobody had the luxury of choosing their clothing. You wore whatever you could afford, which was usually a rough, shapeless garment designed to get the job done and nothing more. Whether you were a man or a woman, the basic idea was the same: cover your body and survive. Fancy cuts or flattering silhouettes. Ha! If you were lucky, you'd have a tunic that wasn't full of holes, but fashion forward wasn't even on the radar. It was more about practicality, and practicality in the medieval world meant wear it until it falls apart. The real fun begins when we look at layers. You didn't just wear one tunic and call it a day. Oh no, the more layers, the better, because you were battling the cold more than anything else. The problem was that these layers didn't exactly fit well together. Picture yourself bundling up in multiple pieces of fabric that didn't quite match, that were stiff from lack of washing, and that probably itched at every corner. That wool coat you're wearing, it was as stiff as cardboard and just as fashionable. The fancy people wore multiple layers of velvet, silk, and fur. But the reality was that, for most people, layering was more about survival. These layers didn't allow you to move comfortably. If anything, they made life harder. You couldn't reach for something without feeling the uncomfortable squeeze of a tight sleeve or the scratch of wool against your skin. And let's not forget about the shoes. Medieval footwear was basically like walking around in bricks. Boots made of leather and wood, with thick soles to keep your feet from freezing in the mud, were about as comfortable as they sound. There were no soft sneakers or stylish boots. No, these shoes were built for one thing: to keep your feet from getting eaten by the cold. The lack of modern cushioning meant that your feet were probably sore by the end of the day from walking long distances on hard, uneven roads. Imagine walking in shoes that don't bend, that are heavy, and that stink because, surprise, foot hygiene was not a priority. You weren't going to catch anyone's attention with your fresh kicks. Now, let's talk about headgear. You thought hats were bad today. Medieval headgear was next level. If you were a man, you probably wore a hood that was attached to your tunic, a basic way to keep your head warm, but also a way to protect your face from the constant bombardment of bugs, wind, and rain. But if you were a woman, you were expected to wear a wimple or a veil. A veil wasn't exactly stylish. It was more of a "don't look at me too closely" kind of accessory. These headpieces were meant to hide your hair, something to keep your appearance modest, and, more importantly, to keep your hair from getting infested with lice. Yes, lice were a constant problem in the medieval world, so covering your hair was more about pest control than fashion. If we're talking about the rich folk, though, their fashion wasn't much better, just more expensive. Nobles wore finely made garments. If by finely made, you mean made of heavy, uncomfortable fabrics that restricted your movement. You couldn't raise your arms without feeling like you were wearing a medieval straitjacket. And as for the jewelry, sure, it was flashy, but it wasn't exactly a fun experience when you had to walk around with 10 pounds of metal weighing you down, all while trying to avoid getting smothered by the thick layers of fabric you were wearing. The best part: that fashion wasn't just inconvenient, it was impractical for actual work. Peasants had to trudge through fields, carrying heavy loads while wearing layers of itchy wool, leather shoes that didn't bend, and headgear that might fly off with the slightest gust of wind. Imagine trying to harvest crops while wearing something that made you feel like you were wrapped in a woolen cocoon, only to find that after hours of hard work, you were still freezing cold, uncomfortable, and probably covered in dirt. And that veil? It was probably slipping off your head as soon as you bent over to lift something. It's hard to focus on your task at hand when all you can think about is how your outfit is digging into your skin. So, the next time you think about the fashion struggles of today, remember that medieval fashion was so much worse. It wasn't about looking good. It was about surviving, avoiding freezing to death, and trying to keep pests from turning your clothes into a moving home. And while you may complain about tight jeans or itchy sweaters, just know that medieval people would probably have traded their woolen tunics for a nice pair of jeans any day of the week. Because as much as fashion has evolved, at least we don't have to worry about freezing to death or having our clothes turn into a breeding ground for bugs. You've probably heard of the Black Death, the terrifying plague that wiped out about a third of Europe. But did you know it was also a social event? Everyone was talking about it, wondering if they were next. No big deal, right? So, how did it actually spread? How did people live with the constant threat of infection hanging over their heads? It's not just the normal fear of getting sick. It's the fear of getting sick and dying a slow, miserable death while your family watches. Sounds fun, right? Let's start with how the plague actually spread. Medieval people didn't have modern medicine, so they didn't know about germs or bacteria. In fact, they had a very limited understanding of how disease spread. All they knew was that it was everywhere. Fleas, rats, and people. if you could catch it from someone, chances are it was already in the air. The main culprit? Bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on rats. The rats didn't exactly have a nice, warm, pest-free home either. So when they died from the disease, the fleas hopped off and went on to infect humans. It's a little like an episode of nature gone terribly wrong, except there was no one to explain the science behind it. But that wasn't the only way the plague spread. No. It also spread through the air. Yep, you could be minding your own business, strolling through the streets when you happened to breathe in a cough from someone who was already infected. And once the bacteria got into your system, you were looking at a death sentence within a few days. To make matters worse, there was no getting better from the plague. You weren't just going to take a sick day and rest with some soup. No, this was the kind of illness that brought swollen lymph nodes, fever, and all sorts of unspeakable symptoms. And that's the lucky version. The unlucky folks got the septicemic or pneumonic forms of the plague, which meant they either had their blood clotting or their lungs filling with fluid. All of it culminated in a swift, painful death, which didn't exactly scream romantic. Now, let's talk about the social impact. The plague was a catastrophe for medieval society, and it wasn't just because people were dropping dead left and right. It completely redefined social dynamics. Imagine a situation where your neighbors are all either infected or dead, and you're still living in the same cramped house as your family. If you're lucky, you might be able to escape the disease. But you won't be able to escape the terror that comes with it. The uncertainty of knowing whether your friends and family will survive was a daily mental battle. It wasn't just about sickness, it was about paranoia. Everyone was wondering who would get it next, who was hiding it, or who had it and didn't know it yet. The stress alone could have been enough to cause a collapse in morale. On top of the fear of getting sick, you also had to deal with the psychological weight of watching your loved ones suffer. Imagine watching your family members go through the same horrific symptoms that were killing people left and right, and knowing there was almost nothing you could do to stop it. Even the best doctors of the time, who were still figuring out that hygiene was important, had no idea how to treat the plague. Some recommended bloodletting, some used leeches, and some even suggested holding live chickens near the affected areas. But there was no real cure, and the only thing that could have helped was quarantine, which was hit or miss at best. And let's not forget the economic impact. Entire villages were wiped out, and labor was in short supply. Those left behind had to work even harder to try to rebuild their communities. But with fewer hands to do the work, things became a whole lot harder. You think your workday is tough now? Imagine having to pick up the slack for an entire workforce, wiped out by a disease that no one could understand, let alone treat. What made the Black Death so particularly terrifying was that it wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. It was a reminder of just how fragile human existence was. In a world without vaccines, antibiotics, or even basic understanding of disease, you could be alive one day and gone the next. In fact, the rapid spread of the plague had a profound effect on religion, superstition, and even art. People began to see the plague as a punishment from God, leading to widespread religious fervor and the rise of flagellant movements, where people whipped themselves in hopes of appeasing divine wrath. Meanwhile, artists began to depict scenes of death and decay, perhaps in an effort to come to terms with the hopelessness of the situation. In the end, the Black Death wasn't just a historical event. It was a defining moment in medieval history. It reshaped the social fabric of Europe and left a scar on the collective memory of humanity. The plague wasn't just about physical death. It was about the death of a way of life, the collapse of communities, and the loss of faith in the world as people knew it. So, when you're feeling stressed or sick, remember, it could be worse. At least you don't have to worry about a rapidly spreading disease killing off a third of the population in a matter of weeks. Oh wait, maybe don't think about that too much. Just be thankful for modern medicine and wash your hands. A medieval feast wasn't the Instagram-worthy spread you're thinking of. Sure, there might have been a huge roast pig, but there was also a lot of mystery meat. So much mystery that you wouldn't ask questions. And forget about salads or healthy eating. You're lucky if you get some vegetables, and even luckier if they're not moldy. Eating was a matter of survival, not pleasure. But let's not forget about that one special treat, the medieval version of junk food, which was basically the same bread you ate yesterday, only this time with a bit of honey. Let's paint a picture of your typical medieval peasant's meal. You wake up hungry because, well, you didn't have a big dinner the night before. Or maybe you did, but it was so bland that your stomach doesn't even know what to do with itself. You're not going to get anything exciting like eggs or bacon for breakfast. No. Instead, you're probably stuck with some stale, hard bread with just enough moisture left in it to make your teeth question the meaning of life. It's the kind of bread that's more like a weapon than a food source, so you chew it with all the enthusiasm of someone chewing on a shoe. The joy of medieval eating is knowing that there's no joy in it, but at least you're not starving. If you're lucky, there's some cheese to go with it. But it's the kind of cheese that you wouldn't even put on a cracker at a party. It's hard, it's funky, and the last time it was fresh, it probably had hooves. And you're probably thinking, okay, fine, but what about lunch? Well, lunch might just be more bread. If you're even luckier, there might be some watery porridge, but it's not the creamy, oat-filled delight you're imagining. Nope. This porridge is thin, bland, and possibly even sour. It's just some oats and water, hardly the comforting dish you'd expect when your stomach is rumbling. But here's the thing, that porridge could be your savior for the day. It's filling, at least, even if it tastes like wet cardboard. But of course, you can't get too excited because it's not like there's a nice bowl of fruit salad waiting for you. Fruit is a rarity, and if you do get any, it's probably spoiled before you even get a bite. Peasants don't exactly have access to orchards full of ripe apples. Instead, you're more likely to get a few berries, some nuts, or, wait for it, roots. Delicious, right? And when you finally sit down for your main meal, it's unlikely to be a grand banquet of any kind. Forget the idea of a lavish feast with roasted meats, fruits, and cakes. No, you'll be lucky if you get anything resembling meat at all. The medieval meat you're eating could be anything from rabbit to some unidentifiable animal, and you really won't ask too many questions about it. It's cooked over an open fire, maybe salted to preserve it, but who really knows what kind of creature it was before it was chopped into pieces and thrown into your pot? The best part? There's a good chance it's tough as leather, with a flavor that might send you running to the nearest tree for some forest flavor to wash it down. The thought of marinating that meat in anything remotely flavorful? Not likely. You're just glad it's food, even if it has the texture of a shoe sole. As for vegetables, they're not exactly abundant either. If you're a lucky peasant who lives near a garden, you might get some leeks, onions, or turnips, if you can fight off the bugs and mold long enough to actually eat them. And let's talk about those vegetables. They're not the crisp, vibrant produce you see in the store today. They're dull, wilted, and mostly flavorless. That's the thing about medieval veggies. They were not meant to be exciting. They were there to fill the gap in your stomach, not to impress your taste buds. And forget about things like tomatoes or potatoes. Those wouldn't even make an appearance until much later. If you're lucky, the occasional cabbage or a handful of herbs might add a bit of variety, but the chances of getting a fully balanced, colourful plate are slim to none. Now, what about a treat? You're probably picturing a warm pastry or a little honeyed cake for dessert. Well, think again. The medieval version of dessert was a piece of bread with honey. Yes, that's right, bread with honey. If you had access to honey, that was a sweet indulgence. But don't get too carried away with expectations. This wasn't some gourmet dessert. It was simply an attempt to add something resembling flavor to your otherwise bland meal. If you were a wealthier noble, maybe there would be some fruits or cakes. But for the peasants, sugar was an extravagance they couldn't afford, and any dessert that didn't consist of stale bread was a rarity. So, next time you sit down to a 3-course meal with appetizers, entrees, and desserts, just take a moment to reflect on the fact that your medieval ancestors' feast might have involved a stale loaf of bread, some mystery meat, and a hopeful glance at the slim possibility of something edible for dessert. The medieval diet was simple, grim, and largely about getting by. But hey, at least you're not gnawing on the same bread you ate yesterday, or spending the day picking through weeds for something to eat. You're living in a time when food, though it might be the occasional fruit salad, is plentiful, and for that, we can all be thankful. No modern plumbing, no problem. Actually, it's lots of problems. When it comes to medieval toilets, it's basically a matter of suck it up. Because, let's face it, you're going to have to squat over a hole and pray no one is standing next to you when it's your turn. Let's talk about the public latrines, the smell, and the serious lack of privacy. Going to the bathroom back then was an extreme sport, especially if you happened to do it in the middle of a busy street, or worse, in the same place where people threw their trash. First of all, let's set the scene. There's no cozy private bathroom in your medieval cottage. No. The closest thing to a bathroom you've got is a communal latrine, typically a hole dug into the ground, or in some cases, just a bench with a hole in it. And these aren't tucked away behind a closed door for some much-needed privacy. Oh no, these latrines are usually built right along the main roads, or even in the middle of town. So, imagine trying to do your business while crowds of people walk by, not to mention the animals and the occasional cart that's bound to spill its load of who knows what. It's the medieval version of a public restroom, but with all the charm of a street vendor's cart and none of the sanitation. How's that for a little personal space? Now, you're probably wondering about the hygiene, or lack thereof. There's no soap here, no toilet paper, not even a clean cloth to wipe with. Instead, medieval people relied on whatever was nearby. Some used leaves, others used sticks. And let's not forget about the occasional piece of cloth that might be reused by multiple people. But you couldn't exactly count on a fresh supply of anything, and the idea of cleaning yourself in any sort of gentle way. That was a luxury you didn't have. In fact, Your best bet was to quickly get it over with and move on with your day, hoping that you didn't get any unwanted souvenirs. And while we're on the topic of hygiene, let's talk about the smell. If you think the modern restroom stinks, you haven't experienced medieval latrines. With hundreds of people using the same hole day after day, the air is thick with the stench of waste, unwashed bodies, and whatever else managed to find its way in there. You'd have to endure that scent while trying to do your business, praying to the heavens that the wind was in the right direction. There were no air fresheners, no ventilation, and certainly no cleaning crew coming in to scrub down the place. You might have hoped for a little rain to wash away the stench, but even that was a gamble. In some cities, public latrines were shared by everyone, rich, poor, and everyone in between. If you lived in a town or village, the local latrine was often a community affair. The idea of privacy was completely foreign to most people. You were squatting right next to your neighbors, sometimes even your family members, all while trying to get in and out as quickly as possible without drawing attention to yourself. If you were particularly lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, the latrine might even be built near the local marketplace or the town square. Picture trying to conduct business or socialize while everyone around you is holding their nose and trying to ignore the very real and persistent smell of human waste. Let's not forget that this lovely experience was made all the worse by the constant threat of disease. Medieval people had no understanding of sanitation or germ theory, so public latrines were often breeding grounds for bacteria and diseases. In fact, some towns had latrines that emptied directly into rivers, meaning that what you left behind could end up in the very water you used to drink or wash your clothes. So, not only were these toilets unpleasant, they were actively making people sick. It's almost like the latrine was designed to be as unsanitary as possible, convenient for those in need, but deadly for the population at large. If you were a wealthy noble, you might have had the luxury of a private toilet in your castle. But even that wasn't much of an upgrade. Medieval castles often featured garderobes, small rooms with a hole in the floor that led to a chute which dumped everything into the moat or a pit outside. Sure, you had a bit more privacy than the common folk, but you were still in the same situation, just with a slightly more decorative hole to squat over. And let's talk about the experience of using a latrine in winter. If you thought going to the bathroom was unpleasant in the summer, imagine trying to relieve yourself in the freezing cold. The ground could be frozen, and the air was likely so cold that sitting over a hole felt like a personal challenge. And that's assuming you were even able to get to the latrine without slipping on the ice. It was, in every sense, a survival game. Getting in, getting out, and hoping you didn't catch frostbite while you were at it. So, next time you complain about waiting in line for a public restroom or the lack of comfort in your own bathroom, just remember that the medieval latrine experience was about as far from comfortable as you can get, with no plumbing, no privacy, and a whole lot of waste in between. Using the bathroom in the medieval world was an extreme sport. And as bad as it might seem now, at least you don't have to do it in front of a crowd, hoping that you don't get sick, freeze to death, or, worst of all, smell too bad to walk back through town. While peasants were busy trying not to freeze to death, the nobles were busy being, well, totally out of touch with reality. From grand feasts to ridiculous fashion, medieval royalty lived a life of excess that could only be described as ridiculous. But of course, There were also the endless obligations, like avoiding assassination attempts, keeping up appearances, and trying to win the favor of the Pope. We'll take a look at their crazy lives and what it really took to sit on the throne. Let's start with the food. While peasants were gnawing on stale bread and mystery meat, medieval kings and queens were sitting at tables piled high with lavish dishes that would make today's buffet look like a child's snack. Feasts were common in royal courts, and they were less about sustenance and more about showcasing wealth and power. Imagine a table covered with roasted boar, swan, peacock, yes, peacock, and fish that had probably been imported from faraway lands. And if you were truly living the high life, there were pies filled with birds, meat, and other exotic things that you'd never seen or even wanted to see. Of course, all of this was washed down with gallons of wine. Because why not? The idea that a noble might sit down for a meal that wasn't fit for royalty was almost laughable. For them, it was all about decadence and excess, leaving the peasants to, well, hope that the mystery meat didn't make them sick. But it wasn't just the food that screamed excess. Fashion was another arena where nobles took things way too far. If you've ever looked at medieval fashion and thought, what in the world are they wearing? You're not alone. Kings, queens, and courtiers sported outfits made of the finest and heaviest fabrics available. Think velvet, silk, and fur. Because nothing says royalty like feeling like you're being smothered in a million layers of material. The colors were often garish and outrageous, signaling status through the use of rare dyes that could cost a fortune. Purple was particularly prized, as it was a color associated with the highest levels of nobility. So if you weren't wealthy enough to wear purple, you were probably stuck in something that looked less noble and more haggard peasant. As if wearing layers of stiff, itchy fabric wasn't bad enough, nobles also adorned themselves with elaborate accessories. Massive hats, intricate jewelry, and sometimes even crowns that weighed more than their actual heads. And let's not forget the shoes. Pointed shoes so long that you could trip over your own toes, decorated with gold leaf, were a status symbol. So much for comfort. But don't be fooled. Being a noble wasn't all wine, roasted meats, and ridiculous outfits. Being at the top of the social hierarchy came with a set of responsibilities that most people couldn't even begin to comprehend. For one, the constant threat of assassination loomed over every royal's head. You might think that sitting on a throne would be the ultimate symbol of power, but it often meant having to constantly look over your shoulder, wondering who might be plotting against you. Whether it was a rival noble trying to claim your seat, or some disgruntled knight who didn't like the way you treated him. Royalty was not a cushy job. Some nobles even went to extreme lengths to avoid being poisoned or stabbed. Food tasters were common, as was surrounding yourself with loyal, but possibly shady, bodyguards. You could have all the golden castles in the world, but you were still one knife in the back away from losing it all. And let's not forget the relentless need to keep up appearances. Royalty was all about optics. Every event, every decision, every word you said was scrutinized for how it reflected on your reign. The art of diplomacy was so intricate that even a slight misstep could lead to a massive scandal, or worse, rebellion. The court was a place of intrigue, where nobles would constantly jockey for power, attempting to gain favor with the king or queen in hopes of securing land, titles, or money. And the most powerful man in the land? Well, he was probably trying to keep the favor of the Pope. The Church held incredible sway during medieval times, and even the monarchs were bound by its influence. To defy the Church was to risk everything. So the royals were forced to walk a fine line, constantly appeasing religious authorities while trying to maintain their grip on the throne. Beyond all the plotting and the pressure, royalty also had to deal with the sheer tedium of leadership. While peasants were worrying about whether they had enough food to get through the winter, nobles had to manage vast lands, ensure the loyalty of vassals, and fight off potential invaders. You'd think being a king or queen would mean lounging on a golden throne all day, but in reality, it often involved hours of paperwork, meetings with advisors, and decisions that could lead to the deaths of thousands. So, no, it wasn't all luxurious banquets and extravagant clothes. The power came with heavy, sometimes crushing responsibility. The truly insane part, though, is that despite all the luxury and the problems, there were still kings and queens who seemed completely out of touch with the suffering of their people. They lived in palaces, rarely interacting with the common folk, and often made decisions based on their own whims rather than the realities of life in the kingdom. So while peasants were out in the fields laboring just to survive, the nobles were throwing grand feasts and obsessing over their wardrobes. Because apparently, that was what mattered most when you were sitting on a throne. In the end, the lives of the medieval nobility were a strange mix of excess, anxiety, and absurdity. On one hand, they had everything money could buy: food, clothing, power. On the other, they lived in constant fear and paranoia, surrounded by intrigue, assassination attempts, and the pressure to maintain their position. It wasn't all that different from today's celebrity culture, except instead of Instagram followers and red carpets, the stakes were much higher, and the consequences of a misstep were far more deadly. If you died in the Middle Ages, there was a good chance you were buried quickly and without much ceremony, unless, of course, you were royalty, in which case there was probably a lot of gold involved. Let's dive into the dark side of medieval life, how people thought about death, how they dealt with the bodies of the dead, and how they avoided getting buried in a mass grave. Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't a peaceful process. First off, let's talk about how death was perceived in the medieval world. Life was short, brutal, and often unpredictable. People didn't have the luxury of modern medicine to help them fight off infections, viruses, or even minor injuries. If you got sick or injured, there was a good chance you were going to die, and most people knew that from an early age. In a time when death was a regular visitor, people had a very different relationship with it than we do today. It wasn't a rare, shocking event. It was a part of daily life. For the average medieval person, death was almost inevitable, and it often arrived with little warning. The process of dying was just as grim as the reality of life itself. If you were lucky enough to make it to your deathbed, you probably weren't surrounded by loved ones holding your hand, whispering sweet words of comfort. No, you were more likely to be in a poorly lit, poorly ventilated room, possibly surrounded by disease, with no proper medical care. You might have spent your final days suffering from fever, infection, or even an untreated wound. Even more unpleasant was the possibility of dying alone, without the comfort of a hospice or trained professionals by your side. Once you did die, the handling of your body was often a hasty, unsentimental affair. In the best case scenario, your body would be washed, wrapped in a simple shroud and buried in a grave. But don't get too attached to the idea of a peaceful, respectful funeral. For most people, especially peasants, funerals were a low priority and usually involved a swift burial in the nearest churchyard or family plot. The only thing that really mattered was getting rid of the body quickly before it became a source of disease, decay, or even a public nuisance. So there wasn't much time for family and friends to gather in mourning. It was more about practicality than ceremony. In fact, most medieval burials were done without much fanfare. The body would be tossed into a simple hole in the ground, sometimes with a few simple prayers. If you were lucky, your family might have been able to afford a modest headstone or marker, but even that wasn't guaranteed. In some places, the poor were buried in mass graves, dumped in the same hole as dozens of others. These mass graves were often used during times of epidemic, like the Black Death, when the sheer number of dead made individual burials impossible. Bodies would pile up in the streets, and the community would have to act quickly to dispose of the remains before disease spread further. If you were among the elite, say a wealthy noble or a royal, you were treated to a much grander send-off. Royal burials were elaborate affairs, often involving grand ceremonies, expensive tombs, and, of course, plenty of gold. Kings and queens were buried with treasures, and their tombs were often designed to reflect their wealth and power. But even then, the burial process wasn't exactly peaceful. These tombs were often built inside churches or castles. But even these places were not immune to the ravages of time. In fact, many medieval tombs were later disturbed, either by grave robbers or by people in later centuries trying to access the riches buried with the deceased. And then there's the matter of the afterlife. The medieval world was deeply religious, and most people believed that death was not the end, but merely a transition into an eternal afterlife. Whether you were headed to heaven or hell depended on your actions during life, and the church played a central role in this. However, many medieval people also believed in purgatory, a sort of limbo where souls would wait before being allowed into heaven. The church offered prayers for the dead, hoping to shorten their time in purgatory, but not everyone could afford such prayers. For the poor, the afterlife was an uncertain matter, and many believed that if they didn't have the means to buy their way into heaven, they were stuck in a much darker fate. The idea of preserving the body for the afterlife was also a common practice. In some cases, the bodies of saints and other revered figures were preserved through embalming or mummification. But for most people, embalming wasn't an option. The corpse would quickly begin to decompose, often causing a rapid deterioration of the body. This made it even more important to bury people quickly to avoid attracting scavengers, disease, and foul smells. It was all part of the grim practicality of life in the medieval world. Lastly, let's not forget that death wasn't just a solitary affair. It was often public. In the absence of modern embalming or body preservation techniques, the public could often smell death in the air long before the body was buried. Corpses in towns or villages could be left exposed for days, sometimes longer, creating an atmosphere of discomfort and fear. Death had a way of infiltrating every part of medieval life, from the funeral rituals to the smells that lingered in the air, serving as a constant reminder of the fragility of life. In conclusion, medieval death and burial weren't anything like the peaceful, respectful ceremonies we envision today. Whether you were a common peasant or a wealthy noble, death was swift, often unceremonious, and deeply influenced by the harsh realities of life at the time. Whether you were buried in a mass grave or honored with a lavish tomb, one thing was clear: death was a part of life in the Middle Ages, and the end of your journey was often just as rough as the life you lived. At the end of the day, surviving the medieval period wasn't about comfort. It was about sheer willpower. There were no sick days, no Netflix to distract you, and certainly no Amazon delivery service. It was just you, your survival skills, and a whole lot of bad luck. But people still made it through. Let's talk about how, despite the muck, the grime, and the seemingly endless misery, medieval folks managed to keep going day after day. And maybe, just maybe, they had a better handle on life than we do today. For starters, let's be clear, medieval life was tough. The average person in the Middle Ages didn't wake up and have a hot cup of coffee to jumpstart their day, or grab a quick snack from their fridge to fuel them up. No, the first thing you probably noticed was the cold, damp air that crept through the walls of your thatched roof cottage. The next thing you noticed was the sound of livestock, or the smell of unwashed bodies in a crowded space. Breakfast? Well, that was likely a tough, stale hunk of bread, and if you were lucky, a tiny bit of cheese or some thin porridge. Your best hope for survival wasn't through comfort or convenience, it was through toughness. The phrase, "suck it up," was basically the medieval motto. But despite the constant hardships, people kept going. So, what kept them going? For one, it was the necessity of survival. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. There were no social safety nets, no unemployment checks, and no social media distractions to keep your mind off the harshness of life. You didn't have the luxury of slowing down, and for most, taking a break wasn't an option. Whether you were a peasant in the fields or a noble managing a manor, your daily life was filled with hard physical labor. If you didn't get the crops planted, they wouldn't grow. If you didn't keep the livestock fed, they wouldn't thrive. And if you didn't build and maintain your shelter, it would fall apart, leaving you out in the cold. So, the key to survival was grit. But it wasn't just about brute force. People had to get creative in order to survive. Medieval society didn't have modern conveniences or technology, so everything from cooking to cleaning to making clothes involved skills that had been passed down for generations. If you needed to cook, you didn't have a microwave to rely on. You had a fire to tend, pots to stir, and often very little food to work with. If your clothes got torn, you didn't pop into a store for a new pair of pants. You patched them up or made new ones by hand, using whatever resources were available. There was no room for wasting anything, and ingenuity was the key to getting by. People knew how to make use of every part of an animal, every scrap of fabric, and every scrap of food. If you didn't, you wouldn't last long. But beyond the necessity, there was something deeper that helped people keep moving forward. It was the sense of community. In a time when death and disease were ever-present threats, the bonds between family members and neighbors were crucial. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of isolation. They needed each other to survive. In rural villages, for example, everyone worked together to plant, harvest, and protect each other's homes. The same was true in towns and cities, where people relied on each other for trade, protection, and assistance. People didn't always have the best hygiene or the most comfortable living conditions, but they had each other. There was a kind of communal resilience that helped them get through the day-to-day hardships of medieval life. And let's not forget the power of belief. The medieval period was deeply religious, and faith played a huge role in helping people cope with the difficulties of their lives. In a time when life was short, brutal, and often filled with suffering, religion provided a sense of hope and meaning. For many, the promise of an afterlife helped them endure the misery of the present. The church offered solace in times of illness, death, or despair, and it was a place where people could go for guidance, support, and even a sense of community. When things were at their worst, medieval people had the comfort of knowing that their struggles had meaning and that there was something greater beyond this world. But of course, medieval life wasn't all grimness and hardship. There were moments of joy, even in the most difficult of times. Festivals, fairs, and celebrations were often a welcome break from the monotony of work and suffering. People gathered together to dance, sing, drink, and enjoy themselves, even if only for a short time. These events provided a much-needed escape from the harshness of everyday life and gave people a chance to connect with others, celebrate their successes, and forget their worries, if only for a little while. For all the suffering of the medieval period, these moments of camaraderie and joy were crucial for maintaining hope and mental resilience. In the end, surviving the Dark Ages wasn't about having a cushy life or an easy path. It was about making do with what you had, sticking together with your community, and finding strength in the face of overwhelming adversity. People in the Middle Ages didn't have the luxuries we take for granted today, but they managed to survive and even thrive through sheer determination, resourcefulness, and a sense of solidarity. And perhaps, in some ways, they had a better grasp on life than we do. After all, when you're just trying to survive another day, everything else seems a bit less important. So, tonight, as you tuck into your warm bed with clean sheets, heat on your side, and a fridge full of food, maybe take a moment to quietly thank your ancestors. The people who lived through the medieval ages had no such luxuries. They fought every day just to survive, enduring cold, hunger, disease, and hardship with a resilience that we can barely imagine today. And despite everything, whether it was the constant threat of death, the misery of life in filth, or the soul-crushing monotony of endless labor, they kept going. They found ways to connect, to celebrate, and to push forward. They survived. Because history may be gross, terrifying, and deeply uncomfortable, but it's also proof that people are incredibly stubborn, hopeful, and, yes, sometimes ridiculous. Every hardship they faced, whether it was battling a plague or dealing with a medieval toilet, was just another step toward creating the world we live in today. A world that, yes, might have its own set of challenges, but at least we're not trying to survive in a time when a bad meal could kill you, or your closest friends could be wiped out by a disease in just days. So, as you settle into the comfort of your modern life, remember that the medieval folks would have traded their harsh realities for the warmth of a modern home in a heartbeat. The next time you're stuck in traffic, complaining about a bad day, or trying to figure out what to eat for dinner, take a moment to appreciate the ease of modern life and the comfort it brings. After all, life might not be perfect, but at least it's a whole lot better than it used to be. Sweet dreams.